Alright, hey folks. So today we're going to do a little mix down of the Sharp the Nine Jazz Quartet that I recorded with Alex. It's his quartet and that's him on saxophone. So I want to just basically take these raw recordings and do a mix down right here in the video so you can kind of see some of the things that you typically do for like a live session or just basically working with any audio. And I think all of you will work with some type of audio, whether it be samples, whether it be archival audio that you have, or perhaps even some more recent audio that you record yourself in the next week or two. So let's get down to it. What you were hearing was Take the A Train. And here are all the files. So we have the drums here, we have the sax. We put a stereo pair of mics in the piano right and left, and then we have the bass. And so what I did for this is I basically put one microphone on the drums, turned that way down because you can see here it's quite low, and the reason I did that is I think it's in this piece. There was an extended drum solo, at the end, and it got pretty loud, so I wanted to make sure that we didn't peak on that. And typically what I do when I'm recording a group is or anything really, I have whoever is playing perform basically the loudest passage they have, just to make sure my levels don't go too high. So that's kind of what I did, and that's what I came up with. So so the drums are a single SM58 microphone, which is a dynamic microphone. It's a relatively cheap. It's like $100 microphone, but they're very, very reliable, very sturdy. It's called a Shure, S-H-U-R-E. That's the brand, and then SM58 is the model. And those are kind of an industry standard for microphones at a club or a rock show or most shows. And they're really good at just picking up what's right in front of it. They're very directional, and that makes it great for vocals, but also a bunch of other things too. So I pointed those directly at the drums, just one mic, and it was about 3 or 4 feet away from it. And I had one, I believe it was an SM57, which is very similar to the 58, just shaped a little differently, better for instruments than vocals. I put that on the saxophone, about a foot or two away from, basically from Alex. And then the bass, we went directly in, into the interface. And then the piano, as I said, was 2 microphones. It is a stereo pair, just because to get the full range of the piano. And I used AKG 414s, which are really good condenser microphones, which are a bit more expensive, a bit more sensitive, and we can look at those sometime in class a little bit, but essentially, and you can look those up, condenser and dynamic microphones are the 2 main types of mics, and they have different uses. I think condensers are generally more for studio work, less for live, because they are so sensitive. So when you have a live group, you've got a lot of sound going on and can overload it. So that's kind of the mic setup that I used. Right now you can see that I have essentially, well, I did adjust some of the levels already. As you can see here in these spots, I got some leveling a little different, but I put all the panning back to its original spot, except for the stereo pair of mics. You want to pan those hard right and hard left. Everything else is centered. So first thing I basically do when I'm working with audio is I put an EQ on every single track that I'm working with. and I do a low cut. The reason for this is that, and I say the low cut's around, I don't know, somewhere right around 40. You can even make the Q a little bit. Let's see if I can. Yeah, that's pretty good. Right around 40 to 60 hertz, you can start rolling off, maybe around 60. And that's just basically microphones can pick up especially the condensers that are really sensitive. They can pick up kind of sound that is subsonic, or at least that we won't need in here. You know, the instruments that we're recording generally, besides maybe the bass, don't really have any frequencies below maybe even really 100. Well, yeah, ish. The piano can get down pretty low too, but below 60, 70, certainly around in that range, it's fine to cut it off. And what that does is it gives you a little bit more room. It gives you more what's known as headroom, and that's just basically the space until you kind of run out of gain that you can use, and you kind of reach the limit of how loud it can be. And when really making any recording, especially one that would be presented on like Spotify or SoundCloud or something, you want it to be pretty loud as possible. As we talked about the loudness wars and things like that, it's very important that when your piece of music comes on, if there's anything playing before it and after it, doesn't sound too drastically different, because that can be a turn off, and you want it to be seamless and sound just as good as anything else. So in order to do that, you definitely need to take advantage of all the room you have in terms of volume or gain. So this clears up a couple things. This just kind of cleans things up. I'm just going to take this, copy, and paste it in every track. Good. That's a good start. And I would do that with any recorded audio, unless there's a lot of bass frequencies on, that you really want to pick up. Then obviously you don't want to necessarily do this, but generally this is a good practice. So another thing that happened, I'm going to solo the bass here. With the direct in, the bass sort of picked up a buzz, basically. I'm not sure if it was the amplifier or what, but basically, let's give a listen to just the bass alone. Okay. As you can probably hear, there's a lot of kind of high frequency buzz going on, and I want to take that out. And the good thing is that the bass, obviously, is more lower mids and just lower frequencies in general. So it's not going to affect the color or the sound of it too much, which is good. So we're going to put another EQ on this. And I'm just going to kind of make sure we can still hear me here. Okay. I'll adjust this as I go and see if I can get that buzz out of there. I'm going to turn off the microphone momentarily as well, because it also has a buzz. So if I take the EQ down quite a bit, I get rid of it for the most part. But I think there might be a better way to do it, because I'm also missing a little bit of high frequencies, some of the attacks. So instead of taking it all the way down here, I think I'm just going to do something serial EQ. Just kind of the same EQ setting one after another. And this has a greater effect, sort of an exponential effect in a way, on EQ. as opposed to doing something like this. I'm just taking it down. So let's see what this sounds like. Sweet. That kind of took care of that pretty well. I think in the other instruments there's a little bit of this buzz, but it doesn't really come through too much. You could hear the buzz both in through the interface as well as through the speaker that the bass was playing through, because we were also hearing it amplified as well as going directly in to the interface. Okay, so now that we've kind of done this sort of maintenance, let's get into mixing. So, mixing is obviously the art of putting all these sounds together, and in this particular case, it's the art of trying to accurately represent the performance that did happen in the best possible way, right? And so, I think the first thing I'd like to do is get some leveling right. And it sounds pretty good right now, as you can see on the sides here that we do already have. I did already do some leveling and try to get a nice balance, but I'm going to do that right now and see if I can get a decent mix in terms of gain. I think that sounds pretty good. Just kind of boosted the drums a little bit more, and took down the sax a tiny bit and took down one of the channels of the piano. So this kind of a pretty easy mix here, and you know, all the recordings by themselves sound very nice. So now we need to do some spacing, putting the instruments in the stereo field, you know, more left, more right, basically panning. And the way I'm going to pan this is similar to how everyone was standing on stage. So the piano was to the far left. So what I'm going to do is actually just take the right channel and move it a bit to the left. So let's just hear what that sounds like. Cool. I think that sounds pretty decent. Just kind of scoots it a little bit over to the left so we can kind of fit something in the right channel. The reason we space these things like this is not only to give it, you know, a direction and some kind of three-dimensional aspect, you know, the stereo aspect that we can utilize. You know, we used to just have mono and everything would just be in the center, kind of like what we're just listening to, except the piano is obviously in stereo. Everything else is essentially mono, and let's just hear what that sounds like without the piano. It sounds really, really in the center. There's not a lot of depth or space, and it's essentially because everything is just dead center, and there's no stereo recording. Now, of course, the piano helps with that when it's in the mix, but we can also space these things apart. We can move uh, we can pan, let's say, the drums a bit to the right because they were the furthest right on the stage. Pan that over there. I'm going to take the sax and I'm also going to pan it a bit to the right. Yeah, we'll try that for now, although I think I might switch that with the bass and put the bass right and the sax left. Generally, bass and drums go together. They're the rhythm, the most prominent part of the rhythm section, and they gotta lock in. They're really holding the groove, and so typically I like to pair those, but the bass was next to the piano, and then the saxophone was next to the bass, and the drums was next to the saxophone, and the piano was all the way left. So let's just see what it sounds like when we space them as if they were on the stage. Okay. I'm going to try to switch it now and put the saxophone to the left and the bass to the right. Great. I mean, that sounds much better. There's a lot more depth. I think the instrument's a lot clearer and come through a bunch clearer because essentially we don't have all these frequencies competing. So when you have, like, say, the saxophone and the drums completely centered, there's a lot of similarities in the kind of upper mids and lower high frequencies that can kind of mix together. And when they do, it sort of makes it unclear what instrument you're hearing, and it kind of muddies things up. Similarly with the bass and the piano, although it doesn't really happen here, and they have kind of different timbral profiles, obviously. If the piano's playing a lot of low bass notes and so is the bass, that can be an issue. But if you separate them, piano all the way left, or a lot of the way left, and the bass a lot of the way to the right, it will help that. It will make it so those frequencies aren't competing so much and kind of making a muddy mix. What we're going for is clarity and a really good, clear representation of the performance that happened. So for a basic mixdown and panning, this is not bad. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we can add a little bit more space, and what we can do is either put reverb on the on a couple of the instruments. I mean, there already is a decent amount of space here, or reverb rather, I would say, just because we were in Whitmore Hall and it just has natural reverb. Now, we could have put a little bit. I want to listen to the saxophone real quick and see what that sounds like. See if that could use anything. I think that adds a decent amount to this. It's subtle, and it won't necessarily be heard. You won't necessarily be able to identify the reverb on the saxophone, but what it will do is fill out the space, and it will make a fuller sound. This is a very light reverb, but it's, you can probably hear it. more than we probably need, but just to kind of show that. And I feel like maybe we could bring up a couple bit of the high frequencies on here and get a little brighter. I'm just going to see what it sounds like to put a little high shelf. It's this shape here, and it's just kind of like a high boost. So that is. Nice. That's pretty subtle, but I think it's going to make it pop a bit more. I want to do the same thing to the drums, at least with the high frequencies. I feel like that we can get those cymbals to come out a little bit, and maybe even make the hits a little bit punchier by boosting a tiny bit down here. Let's see what that sounds like. Nice. As you notice, the drums are pretty quiet, but what has happened is that we've picked up a lot of bleed over, especially in the piano mics, because those are really sensitive condenser microphones, as you can hear. If I just solo the piano, we really can hear the drums pretty well. Not so much the saxophone, and not a ton of the bass, but the drums kind of fill out. So that's kind of a happy and intentional move, but sort of a happy result from using these kinds of microphones. Good, so that's just a little bit of work done with the drums. The piano sounds really nice because the microphones are great and it happened to be a good placement. I'm going to see what we can do with EQ at all. And if we wanted to see the type of energy that's happening in this, we put a spectrum reader on it, and I'll boost this. We'll see. It boosts a lot here. I do this. Put a bit here. If I do nothing, we can see that most of the energy of the piano is like right in this area. So we can do a tiny boost of that, I think. Keep shutting that off. Lastly, the bass. Let's check this out. I'll turn off the mic for a moment just so we can hear it without it. Good, so the bass is pretty consistent. Sometimes with bass, you'll need to put a compressor on it to make sure certain notes aren't too loud. That can happen with bass depending on the room, depending on the amp, depending on the type of bass, and all those things. But this sounds pretty good, so I don't think I really need a compressor on it. So what I am going to do now is something called parallel compression or New York compression. We've talked about this before. And I'm going to send all of these tracks to a return, right? So how we do that is we turn up these send pots, I'm just going to send half of, maybe like halfway for each. I don't want to send 100% of the signal. Essentially because I just don't need that much. So I'm going to solo just my voice, obviously, and then what I'm sending to this return, which will basically sound like a mixdown, but quieter because I'm only sending half. Okay. So now that I've sent those there, I'm going to put a compressor. Now, as I've said before, jazz and classical music don't have a ton of compression on it, although jazz certainly has more. It's a more consistently loud genre than classical, which is just so dynamic in terms of just louds and softs. So what I want to do is just put a light compression on this, and then also have the original sounds come through too. I'll unsolo them. So let's just put this light compression on. So right now it's quiet enough that we're not really getting any compression. But it will get louder. Right around now. As you can tell, that's way too much. We just want it pretty light. It's going to bring up some of the soft sounds. Cool. Excuse me. Now let's listen to the whole thing. I'm going to take the compressor track off, this return track, and see how that affects the overall. Now it's pretty clear that it makes it louder, and it should, because essentially we're just adding more gain. But it also brings up some of the softer sounds, and I think fills it out. It gels it a bit. And essentially gives it a glued sound. It kind of glues things together. This New York or parallel compression, which essentially is just compression mixed in with the original uncompressed tracks. And this gives you the benefits of having all the dynamics of an uncompressed track, but also having that kind of compressed, gelled sound of tracks that have been compressed together. Okay. Lastly, we need to, as you notice when we're playing it, it's peaking. It's going past the limit that we want to every now and then. I also turn this down a bit. So what we can do at the end here, and I do like to put on just one more EQ and just see what I can bring out a little bit on the master track. So let's just do that. Let's play around with the EQ a little bit, and then I'll put on a limiter and make sure it doesn't go past a red line. And then it's a pretty solid, quick mix down, and pretty basic practices that you would use in this circumstance. I just did a tiny reduction on the lower, kind of lower mids, upper lows, and then then I took the bass down just a little bit because it does get quite a bit hot, a little bit too hot later. And now I'll put on the limiter, and this should just basically stop it right at that point. So we want to put it up right to 0, and boom. Great. So now we have a pretty loud mix, I think a well-balanced mix. It sounds good on my headphones, but you would want to test it on a bunch of different speakers, and then after you found that it's a decent mix on a, you feel like you have a decent mix, then I would compare it to other tracks that are like your track to make sure that they sound not necessarily similar, but that it's not drastically different in perceived quality. Great. So hopefully that you can take some of these practices along with you when you're working with audio. I think some of you may record some things, and that would be good, and I can help you with that. And so when you're kind of doing your maintenance to your audio, I would refer back to this video, go through it, kind of do these practices. And also the mixing, that can be done with anything. It's not just, it's not only working with audio that's recorded like this. It can be with anything. You want to use the same methods of spatializing and EQing and all this stuff. Of course, if it's beyond, which all your projects will be, just a recording, there will be much more editing that you'll do, and so on and so forth. But use these techniques as you go forward and for future recordings that you may do.